and welcome to the Games and Social Justice Public Lecture Series. My name is Biz Nidam, and I'll be your host for this afternoon's programming. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Today's programming, in fact, connects with decolonial education, and I look forward to how we find ways to make this land acknowledgement meaningful in the workshop after today's event. Today's programming is embedded in my fourth-year Bachelor of Media Studies seminar and sponsored by the Popular Media for Social Change Research Excellence Cluster, otherwise known as the Pop Culture Cluster. The Pop Culture Cluster serves as an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary hub for popular media and its impact in higher education and beyond, and seeks to identify the role of popular culture in illuminating and catalyzing social and political change. We have also commissioned local artist Sarah Draws a Crowd to live draw our events and provide a graphic recording of our time together. Her drawings will be projected in real time whenever possible, and then we'll compile the graphics at the end of the series and host them on our website as another form of documentation. It is my absolute pleasure today to introduce our guest of honor, Christopher Marmolejo, who I've been working with them for a couple years now, which I'm very excited about, and you're returning to UBC for a second time to share your work. Christopher Marmolejo is a brown, queer, and trans writer, diviner, and educator. They use divination to promote a literacy of liberation. They are the author of Red Tarot, a decolonial guide to divinatory literacy, published by North Atlantic Books in 2024. They were born and raised in San Bernardino, California, in the community of the Serrano people of the Pines, the Yuhaaviatam Clan, and the Maara'yam. Thank you. We practiced, and yet I still stumbled. With 9+ years of experience as a trained educator focused on cultivating classrooms of emancipatory possibility, they work with students around the world to plant and nurture the seed of divinatory practice, finally weaving tarot, astrology, and curanderismo, thank you, with decolonial queer epistemologies and critical feminist pedagogies. Thank you so much for joining us today, Christopher. I look forward to continuing to learn from you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. I mean, I am personally as a lecturer, I'm open to questions and interruptions and all the things. I'm very casual, somewhat in that way. But yes, thank you, Biz. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. I am Christopher Marmolejo, a teacher, diviner, and author, ready to talk to you about Red Tarot and decolonial divination, all right? And so we'll start off with an orienting quote from Patricia Gonzalez, author of Red Medicine, and I'll show you what that cover looks like. She writes that red medicine is the red of ceremonies and blood, the red earth and red cloth for healing. It is the red of protection and the red and the black paint of the codices and therefore knowledge. It is the red of women's blood powers and red of the woman's direction in some expressions of Nawa thought. It is the red coral worn for protection as in the red thread, the red of primary color and firstness, and the red inside, the color brown. It is the red of vitality and the ability to live and continue. It is the red of original colors and originality. It is the ceremonial red and the red cloth of ceremonies. And so opening that, my book is on the far right, but Red Tarot comes from that framing. A common question I get is, like, what is red? Like, what does red mean to you and what is Red Tarot, right? And so existing within, in particular, many books. My book is an ethic of citations. If you read it, you will find. But in particular, Red Pedagogy by Sandy Grande, Red Medicine by Patricia Gonzalez, whom I just quoted, and Red Skin, White Masks, Rejecting the Colonial Politics of Recognition by Glenn Sean Coulthard. And these works were really primary in braiding, in weaving, in syncretizing the cards towards this decolonial lens from an indigenous standpoint, as someone who is detribalized, as someone who is trans, who is brown, queer, and residing. And so by describing myself and my work as decolonial, I'm invoking this long history of insurgent subjectivity. You know, I take the tarot as a starting point to observe, to critique the genocidal logic of the European colonial racial imaginary. And so I have a daily divination practice that guides me into direct, intentional, and inventive action from this red subjectivity. And so as Patricia Gonzalez does, I use the term red in red tarot to transcend various conceptual borders, to center indigenous peoples and their epistemologies in the world rather than being disempowered at the fringe. As Patricia Hill Collins notes, alternative knowledge claims are routinely ignored, discredited, or simply absorbed within existing paradigms. This conjures up the high priestess for me, who represents these alternative epistemologies, which is to challenge all certified knowledge by testing the taken for granted truths against alternative assessments. Right? Cards like the high priestess then can decolonize our knowledge sources, and reading tarot can align with a feminist ethic. She knows, the high priestess, that colonizers don't listen to what the colonized say, especially if their theories come from experience and not from books. So rather than relying on institutional validation of knowledge and experience, the tarot readers enact this radical act of literacy by placing the cards in the hands of the people themselves. It is the people who become the authority to certify knowledge, able to speak for themselves, to record their unique experience, and trust the truth of the heart to find the wholeness denied in patriarchal supremacist culture. A little background. I know y'all have been primed a bit on tarot and whatnot, but just a little brief as well as background on it. It is an aleatory oracle, right? Meaning that meaning is made with chance, with the random shuffling of the cards that are arrayed on the table, as opposed to, for instance, astrology, right? Which is a measure of your birth and looking at the planets at the moment of your birth or any given moment to interpret. So that's a bit more mathematical and less randomized, right? The standard tarot deck is 78 cards, which brings the major arcana with its 22 trump cards, 40 pip cards or numbered cards, and then the 16 court cards, right? That's pretty standardized. Sometimes you'll find decks that have an extra major arcana or something in there, right? They are a derivation of relation to evolution of the playing cards. Tarot does originate in 15th century Italy. The Cards dei Trionfi, the Visconti de Madron commission deck. This deck, again, was made for a royal family. I like to think of it as like a Fabergé egg, like this status symbol, right? This wealthy art object that was for the elite, right? Moving forward, it becomes in the hands of the people. And then there are various traditions, the French tradition, the English tradition, from which the Golden Dawn emerges, 18th to 20th century occultists, the Golden Dawn was a 1900s English society, that gave us the Smith Rider Waite deck that is now iconic in the template for like countless iterations of the tarot. So that's where it's emerging from, it's a blueprint, right? And so again, this centuries old divination tool has had this significant influence on 20th century Western occultism. And in an unsurprising classical colonial Orientalist move, that Golden Dawn and the European intellectuals, not just them, would link tarot's iconography to Egyptian mysticism to bolster its credibility, right? And so it's all the more vital to stress that tarot is a project of hybridity, right? There's meanings and depictions in art that arise from cross-cultural exchange, migration, and importation. And yet, as every civilization or pre-civilization began with art, the image catalyzes literacy. Tarot takes our tongue, our perception, our interpretation, and praxis into greater breadth and depth. And so often a reading engages generative frustration. What the hell does this mean, right? What is this card meaning, right? As we struggle to comprehend the augur or the omen, the silent language of the image or the chart. So divination demands patience, but it's also humorous, incisive, and uncanny, again, putting the power into the hands of the people themselves. And within its history, we also find representative technology of class mobility, providing a uniquely useful tool to navigate our contemporary economic precarity with a deck that can be irrelevant and satirical in its reflective value estimations. As Gonzalez was inspired by Sandy Grande's Red Pedagogy, Red Tarot is my attempt to extend a paradigm of indigenous reclamation, reimagining and regenerating of self-determined relationships with tarot is my muse. Some cards here, some from various decks. Well, two in the Rider-Waite and then the card readers. And a little red right, and a little red light, the women are sort of gagged at what's on the table, right? They're struck by what the cards are saying. Red reading, it's an epistemological mode, right? In the way that you can take a feminist lens or a gender lens or a race lens to any text, to any media, you can do the same with this red lens, right? And so this mode, though, with the tarot, we're working with the image of society, of the psyche, as an impetus towards a literacy that can liberate. And so Red Tarot evolves this understanding, that understanding, into a project of critical prophetic literacy. Literacy and language, as you all know here, are capital in our socio-cultural worlds. Those with more social, economic, and political power claim for themselves the ability to determine which languages and discourses are legitimized. So as language is an ideological site of struggle, represented by this Queen and King of Swords, right? Reading tarot is an act of resistance by radically expanding who gets to be considered literate, right? Meaning that Red Tarot lives in the legacy of literacy being a means of enacting emancipation. Red light makes each card a prism of poetic political praxis, and the reader unfamiliar with social horror will find their imagination engaged and activated. They will see how colonial consciousness consolates in their inner and outer worlds as represented by the devil. It's within the schemes of perception that symbolic domination is able to obscure itself. Its activities are hidden in our cognitive relationships by working through the very categories and lenses of perception. And so Red Tarot reading works to unveil and interrupt the symbolic violence by resensitizing us to the psyche's uncontested perceptive frames and modes, making it co-responsive to external historical and social environments. Tarot is a queer epistemology. It knows by cohering the chaotic, while also aligning a visual calendar with over 4 millennia of social strata to its iconography. The Golden Dawn, that English society did do us a justice by aligning that deck to astrology, by making that synchronization to the zodiacal relationships, and that opens up to really rich readings. And so reading resonances through time, through culture, to inform the present, to infuse the self with an act of sacrality as an act of the uncanny. The divinatory window is comprised of space, time, and image through which prophetic visions emerge, right? You read for a particular person in a particular place at a particular time, and you get a particular image from a particular deck put on the table. And that's so engaging, right? It's very visceral, but images are slippery. Depending on how they are deployed, by whom, and from what frame they are perceived makes all the difference. The West is ahistorical. It's a remembering of non-Western materials as the empire is grafting other sovereign nations, bodies, and beings onto itself. And so I read, write about, and teach tarot to work against this perception and organizing, emphasizing decoloniality as a deordering of the Western worldview. I know tarot as a tool of transcendent and transgressive knowing. This red work emerges from a collectivity of critique, tying authors in solidarity between and among oppressed peoples and peoples of conscience to divinatory literacy. And so as a queer, brown, detribalized native from under-resourced, marginalized community, I came to tarot already transgressing the status quo. And so it's helped me, tarot, to hone that transgressive power with Red Tarot, and I offer the book to the public to offer you the same. The Nine of Pentacles on the left. Anyone familiar with this beautiful work? This Identifications, Jose Esteban Munoz. Maybe you're familiar with the author and the name. This work does not get as much credit, I think, or visibility as some of his later work, Cruising Utopia and The Sense of Brown and else. The Five of Pentacles, The Wheel of Fortune. By reframing and rereading the text that is tarot, again, it can be claimed as an alternative local epistemology of the people that can renew the divinatory animacy that permeates ancient ways of knowing in our present language body. Tarot reading can be and is often geared towards a spiritual practice that may be at odds with, again, a Western view of certifying knowledge that is disembodied. You're just a brain, you're just logical, you're just purely rational. Let the body and the emotions and the intuition get displaced, right? Reading tarot reads red when it acknowledges, regards, and relates the inner world as a sacred landscape. Divination facilitates the creation of sacred geography so that cards become codices with multiple histories surrounding them, and values and signposts are embedded within a cartography of critical consciousness in their symbolic metaphor. Right? Red readers work with tarot as a mode of disidentification, as theorized by Jose Esteban Munoz, wherein, quote, the disidentificatory optic is turned to shadows and fissures within the text, where radicalized presences can be liberated from the protective custody of the white literary imagination. Any shadow seer therein, as he's describing, right, is an occultist, right? That's just per the definitions, right? And because our current awareness is an offspring of colonial relations, the shadow is the other, the black, brown, and red bodies buried in the white gaze of white empire. Red reading is strategic to resist and confound the identity states white supremacy prescribes. Red readers resist assimilation. They work with dominant cultural modes and materia and restructure them from within to render themselves free and self-fashioned, which is, again, a lot of what the theorizing of Jose Esteban is doing, right? That he's offering or describing or, offering us. The shadow work of red readers aims to foreground the dissociated, divorced, alienated, and dejected, very Five of Pentacles, right? To transfigure our identity matrices and repair our relations. Rogue intellectuals wander in the spaces where humankind's laws are inadequate and unenforced. They pursue the territory of revolt, fashion themselves a revolutionary subject. Is it only these fools who read tarot who could consider what could be beyond coloniality? These are the nomads at the end of empire. Somehow the tarot contains multitudes and multiverses. It is kaleidoscopic, folding in on itself constantly and expanding back again. And because there's never a fixed image or a fixed finite point of meaning, you keep looking. It is a cipher for the nonlinear growth of consciousness. And the Wheel of Fortune is this wheel, like that cipher aspect of tarot reading. Becoming fools who read the tarot, looking for guidance, support, and transformation, forces a foray into the exposed vulnerability. But eventually we become strong with self-trust and courageous in our capacity to deeply feel guided by the universe, or your ancestors, or the elements, or your gut, right? Or the theorists by which you're reading these cards alongside. It can be utterly pathetic to be so open to hope and hunger with nowhere to take it but to call out and cry as you pull cards. You gather all the weakest parts of yourself and derive some open devotion. Cards such as the Ten of Swords, which I'll show in a moment, the Five of Swords, the Five of Pentacles are especially consigned the space of otherness. And when the colonial state classifies you as irrational, sub-rational, or backward, they kill you by considering you the counter to their universalizing conception of the human. Are y'all doing good? All right. The Ten of Swords on the left, relatives performing funeral prayers for 5 members of the Sabah family who were killed in Israeli strikes. And the Five of Swords on the right. Again, uncanny reflections of what's happening in our world, right? The Ten of Swords is the master narrative. And for my context, that would be the Mestizaje, which was constructed to forcibly de-indigenize peoples. It is the tearing from kin and community. It's the mind that holds hate alone. And there's no location for this identity, no clear landscape of return, no country or call home. It is nameless, homeless, dishonored, and violated. The slave is a stranger, and their identity is defined by its death. We must consider if these images invite empathy or critical reflection, or if they are supposed to be some perversion to gawk at. Thankfully, tarot teaches me to read a stranger's book. We are edge dwellers traveling together. If tarot is a mirror to understand lived experience, it's far from self-explanatory. The function of a prophet is inspired utterance. The oracle risks a different relationship to uncertainty, possessing a radical spontaneity. They gamble with meaning that divination is less about fixed outcomes and more about liberation. The augury is always arriving, always shifting, and it's profoundly unstable. So sometimes the spread subverts your intended imposed order, but the cards keep changing as you keep shuffling. And it's fantastic because that means that no one masters tarot. That's not the point of reading. This is not to say that the reading has no barometer of success, no meaningful consequence, nor any practical application. But this helps the reader work against the fixed fatalism of being appropriated by the Western imagination. Instead, be a devotee, be willing to experiment with the most prescient and pressing work of your own healing, of your cultural healing, of revolution, imbibe with divination, dance with it like a lover, because it'll keep you on your toes, flexible and with full range, and what a wonderful romance it would be to always arrive reverential before the beloved. And so my aim in offering this work as a detribalized trans native is to expand the borders of indigenous intellectualism by supplying a divinatory text with a language that acknowledges the broader relations of power, historical domination, the ongoing struggle against colonialism, the ruptured spiritual lineages, knowledges, and practices. And so reddening the tool, the divination tool that is tarot, again, is working against the West. The Western imagination focuses on like this future-centered hope towards this ever-expanding empire that is territorially acquisitive in perpetuity, right? Glenn Schultz-Cortart like really emphasizes that. Like it's not done, it's forever. And so the Ten of Swords becomes this card of genocide. It becomes this card of terra nullius, of air nullius, right? And the Five of Swords is this banishment, is being cast out, this dead naming, the stripping of title, land, status, it's abjection. I will talk about that in a little bit in the next talk. But this fictional future of the West is always made, again, from ongoing practices of indigenous dispossession. Red writing, thinking, reading can reclaim a pre-colonial sacred relationality. And so embodied inquiry is necessary to read red. Take a drink of water. Speaking of the body. Any questions? Y'all good? Good? Just checking in? All right. And so I aim, to valorize the epistemologies, the ways of knowing, right? The creation knowledge of subaltern communities, which are comprised of chamanas, curanderas, artistas, nepaleras, that are spiritual activists as liminal people transiting various realities and psychic states, exploring beyond the hegemonic status quo. As a curandera, a diviner, a red reader, a writer, I often express an oppositional worldview. For my therapeutic philosophies must have an adversarial quality. Not just because I have a martial Jupiter joining my chart ruler, but because the forces that pull us apart are the forces that enslave us, are the same forces that are genociding us and are the forces of the colonial imperial state, right? This language is not meant to maintain an abstract theoretical position. And I know I'm using a lot of big words at you, but y'all here in the university, you can handle it. It arises from and it's grounded on corporeal realities, right? I give anywhere from like 15 to 30 readings a month. I have students that I'm working with in various containers round the year, mostly with working class brown women though. And so I know how orphaned one may feel as a product of multiple colonizations. Any reader, diviner, writer who wishes to seriously heal and imagine a future that's not predicated upon colonial divisions must actually lift the veil. High priestess. They must address in every reading behind every card the symbolic violence that renders the crushing materiality of systemic violence appear invisible or appear natural or acceptable. Right? When mechanisms of sight or towards surveillance, visibility within a dominating white world is dangerous. We know this. The cards tell us that the oracle is opaque and strategically so. When our logical mind reaches toward too tight of a grip, the oracle veils itself. And queer diviners have learned to do the same, very Seven of Swords style. This prismatic perception works against a totalizing gaze of objectifying global surveillance. Right? And so we see on the right the Smith-Waite deck, Two of Wands, which is the card for today at spring equinox. Actually, right, Mars and Aries overlaid against the overseer, right? From, let me see, what do I say? With one palm in one hand and wand in the other, they stand at the terrace of a castle looking outward over their empire. Again, a close-up of the overseer. The overseer, of course, is this extension of the king's sight onto the plantation, onto the colony, right? They're the de facto king on that land. It's through sight, through visual, right? That maintained order, that expanded the empire. You get an image of this so clearly in the Two of Wands, right? It's such a rich card for me. It is a card of being at the institution, right? I've drawn this card for a genius young Latina woman who graduated high school early and was going to Harvard, and while there's so much to congratulate about that, we had to talk about cultural exchange. We had to talk about the power that she was about to inhabit, right? And how to maintain a sense of integrity when she was entering a world that was going, again, to try and appropriate her or going to, there was subtle but deeply looming threats that we had to contend with, right? Even as it's a celebratory moment, right? And so I just can't help but see that in that card. Native peoples in a colonial landscape, continue to worship their pre-Columbian deities by way of syncretic realignment. And so forced conversion was more apparent than real. The Seven of Swords is often this card of deception, right? Indigenous rituals, rites, and idolatry were clandestine in their celebration in the wake of colonial conquest. So I suppose faith has always been clandestine because there's always been religious persecution. And so the tangible dimensions of practicing a decolonized divinatory life is to be seemingly invisible while in plain sight of the state and its colonized citizens. Excuse me. The tarot is an obsidian mirror that sharpens perception. Angles and angles and angles create this balanced portrait of greater depth. Each card shapes overlapping aesthetic engagements with materiality and its metaphysical conceptualizations. And so to redefine our engagement with the tarot requires a reconfigured aesthetic as well to animate that shadow mirror with a renewed agency. And so I aim to use the tarot as a decolonial tactic that allows us to recognize liberatory possibilities for a post-colonial future. Emma Perez reads Sherry Moraga to tell us that the possibility of decolonial future is reliant upon the subversion of methods that produce normative notions of gender, sexuality, race, and being in general. And so the reading requires comprehending temporal unity. To see into a tenable future, red reading reconsiders our self-understanding, sense of belonging, and subjectivities. The reading must continuously reorient and recenter the much larger intent to improve material conditions for the subjected, that is, those under the dominion of a government or ruling power, and thus materially and psychically also shaped by those ruling powers. So we've got images of the tower here. The tower on the far left in particular, I mean the tower in general, but it's this card of straight time, again, as Munoz discusses, right? That is strangling us, right? And that's why it must come crashing down. Straight time is all-encompassing. It's arrested, it's atrophied. It's always stranded in the ever-present here and now of apocalypse. Beset with nonstop nervousness and fear, we succumb to the protocols of straight time. But then the tower comes and it falls and it evokes an ontological shift. That is the D of decolonial, that undoing of coloniality that opens up space for alternative realities, subjectivities, orientations, and outcomes. That's the tower's aim, to undo the imposition of westernized modes of thinking, existing. That phallus of toxic masculinity can come crumbling under resurgent native cosmologies, queer feminist consciences. And while deconstructing Western scholarship is a significant process, decolonial methodologies do require more than that, right? So for tarot to be a tool of transcendent knowing, it must transgress. The reader must work against the deeply embedded structures of Western thought. They must nourish emancipatory knowledges that undergird all revolutionary praxis. So for any meaningful prognostication, the cards must unpack, undo the West's naturalized land claims, the internalized acquiescence to the colonial order, which will take cutting the deck, of course, thousands of times before the psycho-affective attachments of the colonial condition are ruptured. Right? This means attuning with the cards to the subtle responses to any tableau or small gallery of prophetic images arranged before you. In a social world that is constantly overriding our felt sense, tarot reading becomes a practice of learning to trust the intuition, the instincts, the sensorium. Visual artist Adi Miyako uses the tower in her deck to name the wounds her and hers bear, To signpost her own personal social history of horror, she reformulates the tower in her artistic rendering. She historicizes the tower, showing it as an empty guard tower from Topaz, which is one of the 10 Japanese internment camps in the US, where her grandmother was held there for 4 years. In her guidebook, she writes that on February 19th, 1942, the signing of the Executive Order 9066 authorized the unjust incarcerations of people of Japanese ancestry into concentration camps. More than 110,000 citizens of Japanese descent, many of them American citizens like her grandparents, were held in those camps during World War II. During the time my grandmother, she says, was at Topaz, my grandfather fought for the United States as part of the 442nd Infantry Regiment. Same, right? The Topaz internment camp clearly signals the internal colonialism even legal citizens are subjected to under empire, right? The tower epitomizes this patriarchal domination that dismembers the mother, the sister, to assert its authority while equating femaleness with foreignness and darkness. Nationalism becomes racialized in order to exile the foreign and the female. Right? The moon, which is often believed to be responsible for lunacy, comes after the tower's fall, like within the major arcana card 18. And so mothers, obviously, as well, though, who allow for patriarchal assaults upon any child's psychic, physical integrity betray us just the same. But betrayals like these configure our relationships with self and others to be wholly destructive. But our artist here is depicting a vision of nature healing the horrid histories of racist incarceration. Typically, nature is thundering down with liberation and lighting that casts down the king, the queen, and their castles too. But the overpowering nature for Miyako's vision is of purple flowers, reclaiming the surveilling site as she reclaims her family's story. Her tower becomes a vehicle to imagine a more just future. Her water paint style is the perfect vehicle for her invoked intersubjective memory. The tarot is a shimmering object, as the images it offers are conjured from the primordial waters of the psyche. She's using art to reclaim the structure psychically while pointing toward the necessity of structural revolution that may not eradicate all sites of racist domination, if only to serve as a looming reminder of our human capacity and history for conquering abuse, right? Wrapping up here. So 2 of Cups, the 2 of Pentacles, and the 2 of Swords, so some 2s here. You know, for the tarot to be a tool for decolonization, it requires, again, the body's testimony, and for the witness of other bodies, that is the reading, right? It may be a moment for transmission. When the card comes between your hands, it's a moment to work with the flesh and body before you, with the specific time, place of the reading. The artist's inspired card, as you artists will beautifully be designing cards. The querent, the question, and we reach toward an intersubjectivity that decolonized self-conceptualizations emphasize, right? The reading is a movement through a series of affects, including anger, melancholia, desire, humor, and more. A red reading claims space conducive to at least a temporary decolonization of the self. But the reading has an afterlife. It has an echo and a whirl, and that the words and images ideally ripple, you know, in the querent's psyche till at last the augur actualizes. So we write and read in watercolor. It is a tactic, the reading, a movida toward decolonizing ourselves by reinforcing the need for dialogic listening, right? Which is a key practice for decolonial feminist methodology. And the subaltern can't speak because she is not heard. So to establish a habit of listening to others without epistemic violence, that is a key quality of an ethical, transformative reading based on principles of mutual respect. You know, keep distinct socio-cultural histories in mind when reading for a plurality of psyches, a diversity of social bodies. And we can only read for others if we are committing to listening and learning the other's way of being and seeing. We don't get to satiate a Western need to control knowledge or to own the omen. You know, a red reading finds the political in every day so that the daily practice of pulling cards becomes a documentation of working class lives, persisting to transcend exploitation, find belonging, and heal their soul. Red Tarot understands that the meaning within everyday social relations is to be inscribed, decoded, deployed, translated, and circulated. It's enacting a rubedo, That is the flesh entry into reality that we know viscerally, radically. As readings are a dialogic experience between querent and reader, text and audience, card and consciousness, they can be seen to enliven an oracular cultural mode of knowledge production that's wholly contextualized within the field of interaction, intuitive, emotionally sensitive. The alchemy of read reading looks upon the reality of the image as more than what has been, opening a door to an eros repressed through chemical reactions fixed on metal and paper that represent desires and lusts, longings and yearnings. Reading the whole body, the socially matrixed body, the emotional body, the soul is erotic reading. The divinatory mind is a speculative mode offering what might be termed an ethics of equivocation that enables something like an ontological humility or an ethos of ontological multiplicity. Two of Pentacles, hopefully, it's clear. Read reading fosters a perceptual disposition, that delves into disorderly ways of knowing. Two of Pentacles, this is a deep card of precarity. Its awareness may be more perplexing, ambiguous, fractured, and fractal, but is not necessarily less reliable. Its images are aesthetically dubious so that our readings acquire epistemic flexibility to skillfully navigate and inhabit multiple worlds. I have students, I'm sure we'll get into it with y'all, but I have students and clients like from all sorts of different contexts, right? But I understand that we are all positioned and differently situated, but operating within a colonial empire, right? And again, it takes skill to be able to switch modes, right? While still maintaining ethics to meet the other. This power, it's like decolonize the gaze, right? Again, to the Two of Swords, right? A decolonial gaze is a radical subjectivity that restores those objectified by white supremacy, including the animal, the plant, the mineral, the silent and unseen worlds. The gaze that objectifies the other is undone as it comes to understand its subjectivity. The individualistic vision of humankind works to alienate the individual from their membership in an oppressed class. You all know this, right? But cards like the Magician sustain the heart of collective culture in language. Language is cultural preservation passed down via oral traditions, transmuting across time into patois, slang, and colloquialism. I can't teach you a native language, but you still can listen to the ocean, to the shores, to the rocks, to the morning, to the east wind. You can experiment with a language where all is alive and all has a story. The cards want nothing more for us than to tell a story, one that reflects our intricate connection, evidenced and strengthened in the act of communication. And by expanding who we commune with, our language shifts. Our language is redeemed, for it is possible to resist reducing the personhood of the non-human. It's unnatural to relegate to or to be relegated to the non-status of it. Nature does not speak the language of slavery, nor does it prepare us for enslavement. Colonial language constructs a grammar of violence by the order of its relations. The tarot offers a language, a system, a logos, if you will, for intuitive soul communication via the art, the body's pathos, and the environment. It offers a language to listen to an intelligence other than our own. The image becomes alive first within the imaginal realms during memory and imagination. I always loved this page of Pentacles. It's like this kind of counter to the Hamlet image, right? Debating suicide, is it all worth it with the skull in hand, but instead is upholding this potential, this symbol of life rather, right? A memory, that gets stirred here from the waters of the psyche, looking up and then we get a mermaid, a dove flying overhead, like what are we looking at? What's in there? There's this conjuring of all these stories lost to imperialism, colonization, slavery. The more that we meet the cards in the manifest world, the more that this memory is conjured. Again, tarot reading then can become a ceremony of memory enlivening indigenous intelligence. And without this communion of intelligences, the world would be a collection of facts, but it would have no truth. Truth requires intelligence. The image speaks back in a silent, wild language, whereby we discover an archaeology of the symbolic supernal communication. We dig up disjointed bones of memory and give the gods a body again. We remember the spirits residing in the image, and we begin a relationship of respect so we can consciously consent to the sacred attunement. we discover that the images themselves are an ancient memory, a doorway to communicate with the divine that animates all. What memory might the dead, seeming cold rocks, the bay, the maple tree conjure within us? This more than human communication, of, I will say cards like the magician, but like these cards as well, is a transgressive literacy. By restoring communication with the more than human, we remember our autonomy, our cosmic anatomy. We find an expression of the profound peculiarity of our shared interiority. In the imaginative space of the reading, readers, will offer divergent accounts for reality through variable frames of reference presented by each card. We get into whole mermaid lore with this suit in this deck of this Ace of Cups, and there's a real rich history to that. That becomes quite prescient in a reading when it shows up. With frame after frame, of reference, it's clear that each card is not establishing the boundaries of truth. Rather, it's discerning the appropriate interpretation, understanding, and ordering of truth from an array of visual possibilities. We can pull cards when we're lost in the dark, when we're displaced and despairing. And the cards are like flashlights through dark tunnels of our interiority, finding all of the psychic fault lines of violent eruption. But for me, they shine with their own light. And then they are a cyborg technology, processes that allows my stride to be walked with dignity. With my red writing, I repair my people's innate divinatory faculty that was ruptured right with their indigeneity. The cards are demonic forces, not demonic, but demonic, spirits that can guide and assist us through our multi-dimensional excursions. Through the looking glass, we can find in the tarot a 78-port entry into another realm with another opportunity for finding and inscribing the pain, the love, the memories, the fears, the mundane, and the sublime of life. We need them not to just allay fear, but also to find inner treasure, to be led into the possibilities beyond the known world of hierarchical domination. And if we look long enough, we will find unexpected guidance in the designs for living. And that brings me to the end. So thank y'all. Again, this is my book. Thank you. Please stay connected. If you like this slide, the slides, which has a little bit more, you can find them on my Substack, which is there. And I offer private consultations and I write. And so, stay connected.
Thank you so much, Christopher.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. And we're going to have some time for questions now before we take a break, and then we turn our attention to a workshop that's going to facilitate us doing some of the work that Christopher just introduced to us. But I want to open the floor for questions for students and other participants, and even from our virtual space, because we do have upwards of 20 participants Zooming in today. So I invite your questions. Does anyone want to begin? I have student questions on my computer that I haven't downloaded yet.
Oh.
So I need one of you to ask. Wonderful. While I do that work, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a great presentation. You mentioned about Miyako's sort of transformation of their card and kind of reclaiming the Tower card in their own way, thinking about their family's history. How do you find the artist who creates the tarot cards that you're working with influences your readings and how that works? Because I'm not really familiar with tarot, so
yeah,
just
I have a Libra moon. If you know anything about Libra, we're an artist. I love tarot because I practice astrology as well, and that's just symbols. It's just a glyph, and that's less visceral for people. But you show an image, and that's easy for anyone to engage, right? And so I get to be a deck collector. I get to justify that in this being the work that I do, and also present art to people that might not otherwise have access to art on a regular basis, and use that to, again, connect with them. And so it really becomes the I take the kind of archive of what I know about that card that is always growing and expanding, and a real thread, and particularize that via the art of that deck that client has chosen in the moment from my growing collection. Yeah.
Excellent. Do other students want to speak their question out loud? Okay. Anybody on Zoom? Okay, well, I will turn to some of the questions. The students are confident that I will read their questions aloud, hence they do not always raise their hand. When we consider the provenance of tarot somehow coming through Italy and Europe more broadly, how does its own history of colonization and Orientalism in its dissemination relate to the finding of meaning and decolonization in its practice?
Well, right. I mean, it shows us a European center. It shows us, a European art world. You get images of revolution, you get kings, you get queens. Again, as I was showing that Two of Wands, which is from the Rider-Waite deck, you get an overseer image, which is directly applicable to the U.S. and others' histories of enslavement, right? And so it's I think representative of what we're working with, of being able to show where the colonial consciousness is embedded, in its history, and then work from there. Does that
Excellent.
make
Yeah,
sense?
no, definitely. That's excellent. And a sort of along those decolonial lines, a student is asking about within normal educational context, how can educators and activists begin to include divination techniques such as tarot or astrology in their work in a way that is consistent with queer and decolonial methods?
Oh my gosh. Within normal education system, I mean, I think that, just being willing again to sort of transgress, and that the tarot is the work that you're modeling, having students create their own cards, learning about tarot, learning about different ways of knowing, starting their own private practice, bringing the prompts into perhaps encouraging students to start their own private practice and then share some of the insights within the classroom, to collaboratively work to critique an image, to read an image together, and apply a different lens. I teach tarot independently, but each week we'll go through different reading exercises. It's like, okay, let's apply a gender lens to these images of the material that we're working with today.
Yeah, I was immediately thinking about some of the other work that we're doing together, and inspired by Red Tarot, I invited Christopher into my class on gender and sexuality, where we're doing similar work that is and isn't connected with some of the work that you're doing in the book, connected more with your practice. And it's been so interesting to invite students to do these readings through the lens of queer and gender studies of these cards, and activating those critical thinking skills as they apply specifically to the content of that course. And so I think it's really interesting to be setting this work in dialogue with various themes that I'm teaching. And it's been very rewarding for me, and we'll see.
Yeah.
Other questions from our audience? One from Zoom that I will read aloud. How do you conceive of temporality in tarot? A linear temporality, a prioritization of the present? How can we envision distinct temporalities through tarot?
Often, so common spread, and I believe you've been teaching your students this, right, is the past, present, future spread, right? And there's a lot of emphasis on that. That can evoke a lot of anxiety for people because they're like, I don't want to know what's coming. A lot of people like, I'd rather not know, kind of a thing. For me, I do a daily divination where it is geared towards like what will happen in the day, and it's for me like a buffer. But if it's, I don't know why I get this visceral image of like falling instead of just like splatting on the ground, you just get like this little bit of buffer to break the fall. But with a client, in doing even a 3-card reading, yes, it is presented linearly. It may be shifting that around, but it becomes this understanding of like how the past is contextualizing how the person is arriving before us, right? And then the future, as well as like, I like to pivot. Like I said, it's more spherical. It's more, even the tarot itself, death is in the middle. There are a lot of cards of resurrection. There are a lot of cards of being, like the hangman is this arrested somewhat development. It's this growing sideways, if you're familiar with that sort of queer theory. Again, the tower is this card of like capitalist time coming crashing down. And so the cards, you might be pulling a card every day in your daily practice. You're like, why won't this card leave me alone? Like, what is this meaning? Or it comes up again, and those issues come up again. So I think it helps us to disrupt like, again, that like Western notion of progress and always just advancing forward in the march of time, and helps when you're to engage a different time mode. Yeah.
I'm going to draw one last question from my student deck of questions because I want to give you a break and the students a break before we move into the next part of programming. And this one's kind of a playful question. What's your favorite tarot card and why?
That's a hard question. I don't know that I have. I think it shifts my favorite one.
What's your favorite card right now? What resonates
Yes.
for you?
Today I'm going to say the Ace of Swords. I drew the Ace of Swords today, this morning, which is, I would say, is a great sign. Of course, the sword is to be offered an ace. Any of the aces are like they're handing you something. And the Ace of Swords is a microphone. I would say it's a pen, it's a book, it's a theory, it's a word, it's a voice. So I'll go with the Ace of Swords today. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, in the spirit of handing over the microphone, I'm going to put this down for a few minutes. We're going to turn off our recording.